Hey guys, it's time to try a few examples that are in a little bit different of a setup than our previous examples. You'll notice on this one, our exponent, or power of 2, is actually on the outside of a set of parentheses. So, we've talked about when we've solved the equations before that parentheses are kind of like a force field, and we're not allowed to deal with anything inside of the parentheses until we deal with the stuff on the outside of the parentheses first. So if here's my x, my goal is still to isolate that variable. In order to get to it, I have to get rid of everything outside of the parentheses first on this. So to do that, I am going to do what we did last on the previous problems first, and I'm going to take the square root of the whole left side of my equation. And if I take the square root of the left side of my equation, I have to be fair and take the square root of the right side of my equation. When I take the square root of that left side, my square root sign and my squared will cancel out, leaving me with just x minus 7 equals. And now we have to be careful with the square root of 6. It looks like it will just be the square root of 6. But if we think of taking the square root of 25, on like we have the previous examples, the square root of 25 is not just 5, it's also negative 5. Because 5 times 5 is 25, but negative 5 times negative 5 is also 25. So when we do this, we'll actually get two answers. This will be a plus or minus the square root of 6. Once we get to this stage, we go to the side of the variable and we still do the opposite. So there's the variable. The opposite of adding 7 would be, or the opposite of subtracting 7 would be to add 7. Add 7. Those cancel out. And we left with x equals 7 plus or minus the square root of 6. So now we're not done quite yet. We still will get two answers because when we got to the x squared equals part, our answer is greater than 1, or the part of the problem is greater than 1. So we will have two answers to this. And in order to get our two answers, we'll have to actually solve two different problems. And we'll have to solve, well, what happens when x equals 7 plus the square root of 6, and what happens when x equals 7 minus the square root of 6. And I'm getting that from that plus or minus sign right there because we don't know, or we do know that when we take the square root of 6, we get both a positive and a negative answer. So we have to account for both of those. This would be a time we could bust out your calculator and help you out. So on the left-hand side, if I take 7 plus the square root of 6, I get x equals 9.45. And on the right-hand side, if I do x equals 7 minus the square root of 6, I'd be left with x equals 4.55. And don't forget, this also connects back to the roots we talked about earlier. We're still solving quadratics, just not by factoring because we don't have a second x term. So those are still the places where our parabola would cross the x-axis. Those would be our solutions of our graph. If we were to graph this, would be x equals 9.45 and x equals 4.55. Moving on to the next example. Here I have 6 times the quantity of h minus 4 squared equals 42. So I still have to undo everything in this problem. I have to leave what's inside the parentheses for last. So the first step here would be to do SADMAT backwards, and I would divide both sides by 6 first. So I would divide by 6, divide by 6. Those would cancel out. I'd be left with h minus 4 squared equals 7. I don't know if you guys can hear that. I am recording this on Saturday night at about midnight, and the nasty thunderstorm is rolling through that you guys will probably know about time you watch this on Tuesday or Wednesday. Alright, back to the problem. Once I get to here, like the previous thing, I have to get rid of my power of 2 that's on the outside of my parentheses, and I do that by taking the square root of both sides. I'd be left with h minus 4 equals, and I can get rid of those parentheses because there's nothing on the outside touching those parentheses, equals plus or minus the square root of 7. I would then go to the side of the variable and do the opposite. That would be to add 4, add 4. Those cancel out. I'm left with h equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 7. So now I have to solve two different problems. I'd have to solve what happens when h equals 4 plus the square root of 7, and what happens when h equals 4 minus the square root of 7. And don't want to do that. Let me zoom out just a little bit. And when I do that, I get the answers of h equals 6.65 and h equals 1.35. Those would be the two places on the x-axis in which that quadratic equation, in which that parabola crosses the x-axis. H equals 6.65 and h equals 1.35. All right, moving on to the next example. Here I have 1/2 times the quantity of c minus 8 squared equals 3. I could divide both sides by 1/2, but I think a lot of you guys realize at this point that multiplying by the reciprocal of the number is the same as dividing by that number. So my first problem on this, our step to this problem, would be to multiply both sides by 2. And by doing that, that would cancel out. I'd be left with c minus 8 squared equals 6. I would have to take the square root of both sides to get rid of my power of 2. That would leave me with c minus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. I would then have to add 8 to both sides to get my c all alone. And that would leave me with c equals 8 plus the square root of 6, or c equals 8 minus the square root of 6. And my two answers would be c equals 10.45, and don't want that, nope, bye. C equals negative 2.45. And those would be the two places on that on the x-axis in which that parabola would cross. All right, last example for this video is very similar to some of the ones we've already done. In order to access the stuff on the inside of the parentheses, I have to get rid of everything else on the parentheses, everything else on the outside first. So I would start by dividing by 5, dividing by 5. I'd be left with a minus 2 in parentheses squared equals 14. I would then have to get rid of that power of 2 by square rooting both sides. I'd be left with a minus 2 equals this plus or minus the square root of 14. I would then add 2 to both sides, add 2, add 2. I have a equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 14. I would then have to solve two different problems here. I have to say, okay, what happens when a equals 2 plus the square root of 14? And what happens when a equals 2 minus the square root of 14? And I would be left with a equals 5.74 and a equals negative 1.74. And those would be my two values for that problem right there. So these are definitely more of the challenging problems in this lesson, but I really believe you guys are fully capable of that. If you are confused, please watch this video again, kind of slow it down, rewind the steps. But if not, good luck guys, and talk to you guys later.